Some years ago, I was playing around with my computer, and I was looking for a manuscript, and something, I don't know, I pressed the wrong key, as we often do. And what suddenly appeared for me was the heading, Rainbow Goes to Sea. And I thought, oh wow, I forgot that I'd actually put that into the computer. It was an old document I'd had since probably 1976 or something. And it was the story of a journey that I made on this wooden boat called Rainbow. And I just glanced at the first paragraph and saw a couple of spelling mistakes, so I fixed those. And then I saw there were some punctuation marks that were incorrect, and there was some, so I fixed those. And I never did get back to whatever it was I was looking for, because I started to become enthralled with my own story. That's probably all you need to hear. With it ever since. But truthfully, it became a living thing for me to go back and to re-encounter the experiences I had. So, and just to explain how that came about, whilst engaged in this adventure that I'm going to tell you about this evening, my wife and I, wife at that time, Evelyn, she and I had our parents, hers were in Canada, mine were in Spain, and we needed to send them letters, but neither of us wanted to bother writing to say what we were up to. So we used to get one of those old cassette players, and we'd sit down and we'd just record for 15 minutes or so every now and again, maybe every day or 2 days, just a few snippets of things that happened. Well, of course, we'd send the tapes off and never think any more of it. Yeah, parents would write back and say nice things, and never say anything like you have your cotton picking in mind or anything like that. They were all very complimentary. But anyway, some years later, after the trip was over, a friend of ours from Canada who was doing a PhD in English literature was asked, as part of his PhD, was asked to write a book. And he was looking for a suitable subject and decided that our story was worthy of a book. So he went and together we assembled all of these audio tapes. And the beauty is that the audio tapes, of course, contained all these up-to-the-minute happenings as they happened, or just after they had happened, and we were still in shaking mode. And so he started to write down this manuscript for the book, and subsequently sent it to us, and it was that I copied into the computer. But because it wasn't his experience, there were a few anomalies and things that weren't quite the way I would have had them, so I started to correct those, and eventually came up with this nice scrappy thick book called Rainbow Goes to Sea, which is quite a fun adventure, and that's what we're going to play with this evening. Yeah, it's really ridiculous talking to the converted, because the story and the talk and my life and my wife's experience on the boat really changed both of us for our lives, and contributed to a way of life that most people don't get to enjoy. Now, you guys have all done it, even just being here in this room from wherever you've come from. So you'll at least understand this, and but what I was really hoping for was to talk to people who hadn't done it and give them the inspiration and maybe the push to actually go and do something different with their lives and be really outrageous. Well, you guys have all been outrageous. Again, or you wouldn't have been here. But aside from that, I'd like to share the story with you. So it all began back in Canada, and like most of us, we came to a point, I came to a point in my life where I had to make a decision. I was 24. I was the food and catering manager for quite a large hotel in Vancouver Island, Victoria. And my wife was a very accomplished travel agent, and she was 23. And we actually had a very nice income. This is back in 1970 something, 1970 perhaps. And we were young, and life couldn't have been better, honestly. We had a new car, we had furniture, we had a new stereo, we had everything that we really wanted. And if we didn't have it, we just, bought it on loan or took a mortgage out or whatever we had to do. And it was great. We could make all the payments we needed to make, and we had money left over, and we could go to restaurants. We were really having a lovely time. And one day I went into work and I had a coffee shop which was very busy in the hotel, and there were a lot of commercial travellers who used to stay with us, and I had probably about 30 odd staff in the coffee shop, many of whom were part-timers, and they sort of doubled on shifts and things to get be able to look after their children. They were all sort of middle-aged housewives, fabulous ladies, really great, and they did a great job, wonderful service, and they knew how to clean things, and it was really fantastic. It was a great coffee shop, really busy. And the general manager of the hotel called me into the office one morning. He said, Roger, he said, what we're going to do, he said, the directors have decided that they'd like you to let go all of the coffee shop staff, and we'd like to replace them with university students, or high school or university students. We're going to put them in short skirts and net stockings and low tops, and we're going to make it a lot more sexy than it is right now. And I said, I beg your pardon? And he said, well, you understand. He said, you know, he said, it's pretty boring in there. And I said, well, you know, frankly, if I was a commercial traveller at 6:30 in the morning, I actually really would rather see Mum. And I said, you know, I really think this is a dreadful mistake. And he said, well, he said, they've made their decision. And I said, well, I'm totally opposed to it. And he said, well, what do you mean you're totally opposed to it? I said, well, I refuse to do it. I'm not going to go and sack those women. There's no justification. You know, they've been providing us with a great service, and there's no reason we can't do that. And he said, but we've got instructions to do that. And I said, well, I just refuse to do it. And he said, well, you can't. And I said, well, because I am. And he said, well, I'll go back to him and tell him what you said. And I said, well, okay, let's do that. I'll put it in writing if you like. Anyway, so he went back to talk to the directors about it, and they had a conversation, and finally he came back. He said, all right, he said, they've agreed with your decision, and they're happy to let it run. But don't ever refuse to do what you're told to do. Otherwise you won't have a job. And if you lose your job here, he said, you won't get another one on the island. And he said, you'll never get this level of pay, and you'll never be able to support the lifestyle you've got. So he said, you have to do what you're told to do. Now, up until that time, I'd never actually had the experience of being told that I had to do something that was against my will. And truthfully, I had no idea where the courage came from to stand up for what I believed to be true. And I went home that night and said to Evelyn, you know, I've got a problem. And she said, what's your problem? So I said, well, I explained. She said, well, I agree with you. And I said, well, you might agree, but I said, the truth is that I'm on real shaky ground here, because, you know, the next time they tell me to do something, I'm going to be faced with a real crisis. You know? And I said, we're living way too far above our means, and we couldn't afford to lose our salary. We couldn't afford to lose her salary either. One of the salaries went with me and Dick Poo. And I realised we were totally vulnerable, and it didn't feel good. And so we sort of thought about it and said, well, what could we do? And the only thing we could think of doing was downscaling as fast as we could to get ourselves out of the level of vulnerability we were in. Well, I think we must have spent probably 2 days really mulling this over and being very unhappy with the position we got ourselves into. And a friend came over from Vancouver to the island for the weekend to spend the weekend with us, and was due to arrive in time for breakfast. But he didn't. He arrived late afternoon, and we said, you know, where have you been? And he said, oh, he said, you wouldn't believe it. He said, I heard a story about some people in a marina up north of here who are living on their boat with their kids. I said, I'd get off. And he said, no, seriously, they're actually living on board the boat with the kids. And I said, oh, that can't be very common. How big's the boat? And I envisaged sort of an 80-footer or something. He said, oh, it's 36 feet. I said, 36 feet? 2 kids? You can't do that. He said, well, they're very happy. So the seed was sown. So next weekend, Evan and I drove out to the marina, and we wandered around the docks looking for a family living on board a boat. And sure enough, we found them, and there's this little kid swinging on a rope way out off the edge of the boat, and then swinging back the other way, and he's about 6 years old, you know, he's having a ball. And Father's there with a paintbrush, and I said, hey, are you living on board? And he said, yes. And I said, he was from England, and I said, why not? I said, what's it like with a family? And he said, great. And I said, really? I said, it's hard to imagine. He said, do you want a coffee? So we went on board and had a cup of coffee, and we'd had a cup of coffee and a chat with he and his wife for a little bit, and he suddenly said, what are you doing next weekend? It's a long weekend. And I said, nothing really. He said, do you want to go sailing? We said, don't really know anything about it. Wouldn't be much use. He said, no, we're just going for a cruise around an island. He said, we're not going to go big time sailing, but he said, if you'd like to come, we'd like to take you and show you what it's like living on board. We'll leave the kids with the grandparents. So we said, yes, that'd be fantastic. And so it started. But it was a crappy weekend. I think it rained most of the time. It was bloody cold. It's really cold most of the time up there. And anyways, we went off, and in the evenings, sitting down in the cabin with the water lapping at the sides of the hull, the mast creaking, and the dim lights of the kerosene lanterns inside the cabin going, it was really romantic. And he started telling us stories of his time on submarines and how much fun he'd had at sea, and told us a few ghost stories and things like this. It was really neat. Why is it that when anybody gets a hobby, they want everybody else to join them? Look at us lot. Like a major recruiting agency. Anyway, so we got totally sucked in by Michael and Gloria, and so we were sitting there, and they said, you know, we're thinking of going around Vancouver Island next year. And we said, wow, right the way around? It's a big island. We said, yeah. And he said, how long will that take? He said, probably about 3 weeks. Get up the inside passage and come down the Pacific coast. And I said, it's pretty rough out there, isn't it, on the coast? And he said, oh yeah, it can get really quite hairy, but he said, we'll be okay. So he said, wow, that'd be really neat, wouldn't it? Evan and I was thinking, wow, if we had a boat, we could go with them. It'd be really great. So anyway, Monday morning, or Tuesday morning came, and first thing I did was go straight past the hotel on my way to the yacht brokers. Sitting in the yacht brokers saying, so what do you have for sale? Well, we've got this, you know, what size do you want? And I said, we want to be able to go cruising around the island sort of thing, you know. Oh yeah, liveaboard, yeah. Oh right. So you want a 40-footer really, sort of something around 38, 40 foot. Yeah, that sounds right. Yep, he said, around about $1,000 a foot. I said, $40,000? I mean, this is 1970, right? I said, $40,000 for a boat? He said, yeah, you can buy a house, you can buy 2 houses. So anyway, I said, oh, how about 28 feet? He said, well, you're still looking at $28,000, have you got that much? And I said, oh, no. So he said, you're really looking for something quite cheap, aren't you? I said, yeah, we really are looking for something very cheap. Anyway, long and short of it was that I think he had nothing. So anyway, the following weekend we were back at the marina again. We were gradually becoming known there, and walking up and down looking at the boats, and there was nothing. I mean, there were lots of boats that appealed, but none of them. We actually had no money, truthfully. And although we had a lot of cash flow, we actually had made no savings whatsoever in the year or so we've been working there. And so we stopped, and there was a party going on. We stopped and had a few drinks, and then Michael was sort of chatting around the other people and the other yachtists and sort of saying, oh, these guys, these are our friends, you know, and they're really looking for a boat. And everybody, of course, oh, yeah, you want a boat? Yeah, let me tell you about our boat. Oh, there's a boat for sale over there, there's a boat for sale over there. And then I said, no. I said, we really don't have hardly any money. I don't think this is a workable proposition. And he said, and this one guy said, you know what? He said, there's always the rainbow. And I thought, that's really an interesting comment. What do you mean, always the rainbow? And he said, yeah, he said, it's a boat, it's about 30 feet. He said, it's over on B dock. It's kind of low in the water, you'll see it. He said, it's a bit of an old timer. So I said, oh, really? How old? He said, don't know, very old. I said, oh, all right, well, I said, is it for sale? He said, I think so, the guy hasn't been near it for a long time. He said, you should just go and ask him what he wants. So I said, well, maybe we're going to have a look at the boat first. Anyways, we walked around and we went and had a look at this boat. And she was definitely different. Anyway, we decided that we'd have a look on board if it was open. So we got on board and opened the door, pushed the hatch back, stepped down the 3 or 4 steps that were there into 18 inches of water. Thinking, I think it's sinking now. But it actually had 18 inches of water in for quite a long time. And there were some cushions where, I remember the cushions, they were sort of kind of a pinkish colour, and they've got that kind of burst open look, you know, where the material had given and all the stuffing had sort of come in. And there were a couple of mahogany doors in this boat. This boat, I'll tell you how long it was in there. Anyways, there was a couple of mahogany doors in there, so I opened the door and it was a little lounge area and went in there. Again, the cushions all got, you know, and the muck on the floor and the water was just unbelievable, and it stank, it was rank. Anyways, there's another door, and I went up and I opened that door, and the smell was unbelievable. This is where the toilet, or known as a head on a boat, was. And it was this green bronze monstrosity that was sprouting all sorts of biological attributes, and was actually like one of AJ's sort of pits. Yeah, just awful. And I slammed the door shut quickly because of the smell, and we backed out of the boat. The boat was actually from my stall to probably here. That was the length of it from one end to the other end, and the cabin length was about that much. So there was a bit hanging out the front that wasn't, you know, it was or out the back, it was cockpit and one. Anyway, it was a 2-masted boat, and I don't know what it was, and we just said, well, we were suckers, and we were really young and energetic, you know, we've really learned our lesson now, don't do that anymore. And we thought we could fix this up. And so anyways, we found out his name and address and went up to see him. So knock on the door, and this big rough voice says, "Hello!" Excuse me, could you open the door? Anyway, the door opens, and in there, this man, he must be 6'6", he's got a vast beard, black hair, black eyes, black eyebrows, and he's wearing a lumberjack jacket, and he looks like he should be walking around dragging an axe in a horror movie. And anyways, he's standing there and he's leaning against the doorpost and he says, "What do you want?" So he said, we were wondering if your boat was for sale. And he said, "Rainbow?" I said, "Yes." He said, "What would you want that for?" And I said, "Well, we were looking for a boat that was not too expensive that we could maybe fix up and liveaboard." "You want to fix it up and live on it? Are you out of your mind?" I said, "Well, probably, but that's the idea that we have anyway." And he said, "Really?" He said, well, he said, "I wanted $5,000 for it." $5,000? That's better than $40,000. And everyone's kicking me in the back of the foot. And anyway, so I said to him, "Well, you know, that's we could certainly look at that and talk about it." He said, "How much money you got on you?" I said, "What, now?" It's a bit like any day these days, you know. $2 there might make a coffee if we look in the car. Anyways, I think Evelyn said something like, "Well, I've got $50. And he said, "Give it to me." She had neatly of $50. This is a very powerful man, mind you. And give me the $50. He shuts the door and I think, and he comes back with this sort of 6-inch long brass key, you know, and hands us the key, and he said, "She's yours. Pay me the rest when you get it." He slams the door. We're standing there with this brass key.
Can we buy a key or a boat?
And so begins the story. So we discover that this boat that we'd inherited, purchased, actually came off this warship, and this was built in 1891, and yacht was also built in 1891 in Newcastle on Tyne, and it was a ship's boat that came off the warship. And it's actually this one here, that one. And in the days that they built her, she had a 5-pound cannon mounted in the bow, and she had forts all down the boat. And the Marines would step in and sit there with their muskets, and they would sail it ashore or row it ashore, and then they would run up the beach and fire their cannon. I think that was the idea anyway. It was actually called a pinnace, which was very hard for us. That was P-I-N-N-A-C-E. Although it did get a lot of other names along the way. But anyway, Rainbow was, really became part of our lives. And under sail, she didn't look too bad if you got the angle right with the photograph. It was really good. And we had no idea what to expect from her, and she clearly had no idea what to expect from me. And Michael's brother, David, was also, he was a boat builder, and Michael had learnt a lot from him. And so Michael said, well, now you've got this boat, what are you going to do with it? And I said, well, I think we have to clean it out to start with. And he said, I'll tell you what to do. He said, there's only one thing to do. He said, get in there and take everything out. Everything. Don't leave a thing in there until you've got a bare hull. I said, then what am I going to do? He said, then you're going to put it back. I said, I don't know how to use any tools. I said, when my father asked me if I'd like to learn woodworking, I said, no, I can't be bothered because I'm going to be running a hotel and I'm going to have a maintenance man. Well, didn't the world come and slap me in the face. Anyway, so now I've inherited this boat, and I know nothing. And so I took myself off to the hardware store, and I walked in there and I said, it was actually called Anderson's, and I walked in and I said, look, I need some help. And they said, well, what do you want? And I said, well, we bought this boat and we're going to gut it, and I don't know anything about anything. So can you help me? I need to know about timber, I need to know about nails and screws and what you use for what and how you do these things. I need to know about power tools. I don't know anything. And they said, oh, come on. And there were a couple of old timers in there, and they just really delighted in that. This is a ring nail. It's bronze, right? You don't want to use too many of them, but they're really good. But they're expensive. This is a square nail, and it's made out of copper, and so on and so forth. Anyway, I got my education in the high street. Every time I went in to buy something, they said, "What do you want that for?" I tell them that's the wrong thing. Give them something else. Anyway, our friend Michael said, don't worry about it. He said, I'll be with you all the way. He said, I'll help you. He said, you won't have any struggles. He said, I'll tell you what to do. You do the work. He said, I'll just help you. And he said, it'll be easy. So I said, well, I don't know what to say. I'm so grateful. He said, no. He said, that's not a problem. We got it gutted completely. I had a hammer. I had an axe. I had 2 screwdrivers. And I had something else, a pair of pliers. And I broke all of them, except the axe, in the first 2 days, taking it to pieces. So I'm left with the axe. And finally, I get it all outside on the dock, and it's mounding up higher and higher. And we had quite an aggressive marina owner who, I don't know why he tolerated us at all, because the dock looked like a pigsty because of what was coming out of the boat. And we'd take it off to the tip, and then we'd come back and take some more. And I poured it at 1100 Morris, which we'd had to buy after selling the other car as we quietly downgraded all of our expenses. So anyway, we got the boat completely gutted, and just as we'd finished, Michael came around and said, hey, just come say goodbye. I said, what do you mean goodbye? He said, we're leaving. I said, where are you going? He said, I've got a job down Island. He said, about half a day's sail down Island. He said, we're taking the boat down there. We'll be living down there for about probably 9 months. So we'll see you towards the beginning of next summer. Huh? What about this? Oh, he said, won't be a problem, you'll fix it. And he left me. Evelyn still had her job, I still had my job. My job demanded that I work quite long hours, but I was able to stretch it out a bit. And so if I worked early in the morning, I'd take off a bit earlier in the evening. We both worked probably 18-hour days every day for probably 6 months, or maybe 5 months, to put the insides back in the boat, and we did that. And then finally, I guess September must have come along, and we're going the wrong way. And September must have come along, and we moved on board, and that was really an exciting thing. Anyways, this old boat, as I will tell you, did that ruin your camera as I moved the stool? We sailed this very old boat, 6,000 miles across the South Pacific from Vancouver Island to New Zealand, eventually. And looking back on all since we had in our 20s, literally, to learn how to sail and navigate along the way. And we had no charts and we had no real knowledge of what we were doing. It was a complete adventure. I mean, really stupid. But, you know, we were young, and somehow the universe tends to look kindly on youth and ignorance, or innocence, let's call it. Actually, it was ignorance. Yeah, I think it was ignorance. And yet there was something in it, and, you know, it really taught me that our intuition is the most powerful and yet most often underutilized tool. And I really learned that I needed to allow the universe to flow through me and let things happen. I did get very irate many times, and I got very frustrated and very upset. But I did discover that when I let go, it resolved itself. As did, I think, the slide presentation. Which it doesn't always do, does it, really? And it wasn't very glamorous, all that painting and scraping and the work on the boat. It was a monumental task. It was a very old boat. She was built in 1891, so in 1970 she was 80 odd years old, 90 years old. And she was made of double diagonal teak, copper fastened, which is how the original boat builders in England had built her. And so she had these nice big wide planks, and they got sort of on top of each other like that. But they were quite thin. I remember when I drilled the first hole through the hull to put a fitting in, that it was only about 3/4 of an inch thick. And I thought it was going to be really thick, and it was such a surprise to find that it was actually very thin. It was like 2 3/8 pieces of teak, Burmese teak. And in between the two layers, they'd put a cotton fabric. I don't know why, and nobody could ever tell me why, but there was cotton laid between the two. And so it would always clog the drill bit whenever you drilled a hole in it. But yeah, it was fascinating. But the copper fastenings over all those years and the teak had never deteriorated. They were as good as they were new. I could pull the copper fastenings out, which I did. And in fact, I took them into Anderson's and said, here, look, this is one of the fastenings on the boat. And he bent it, and he kept bending it. And he said, this is unbelievable. We've got his old brother to come over, and they're looking at this thing like it's a piece of treasure. And I said, well, what's the big deal? And he said, let's get a new one. They got a new one, bent it twice, and it snapped in half. And he said, that's the difference between the materials they had then and what we use today. So he said, you got basically a really good boat. And we found some bits of rot in some of the frames, but we fixed that up. And she had no keel. And most sailboats have keels, so this one didn't have one. It had a skeg, which means a long piece of wood running from forward right aft to the stern. And so it was because it was a rowing boat, it was a directional thing to keep the boat on a straight course, which was really great if you didn't want to turn a corner. If you wanted to turn a corner, it was actually like being on ski, you know, it's like takes a long corner. So we always had to take that into consideration. And once we started living on board her, and we started taking her out at weekends to go, and we started sailing with her, we got into such a mess, it was unbelievable. I remember one day we were sailing, and there were all these boats coming towards us, lots of boats, sailboats, and we sort of couldn't understand why they were heading for us, you know. And anyway, we couldn't do much, because there was really nowhere to go, so we just kept going. And went right through, and all these boats partying in front of us, and they're all doing this. We were waving back. That was the Royal Victoria Yacht Squadron having their annual race, and they're all screaming at us, fall off, fall off. I think that was the day we actually anchored in on the other side of the harbour and got the bus back. The little cottage we'd rented, and then went back later on in the afternoon with everybody gone home. And turned the boat both round and we went the other way. And we had an engine in it called Bang Bang, which is obvious, I don't have to say much about that. Every time you started it, bang, bang, but it worked. And it was a petrol engine, and it was a 1949 gasoline engine made by, I can't remember the company now, but it was like one of those indestructible flatheads. It was amazing. And
had that been underwater all the time?
no, the water came just up to the bottom of it. Very considerate. And it was a bitch to get going. It really was. It never wanted to work. And the only time that we could actually make Bang Bang work was when it was quite obvious that the boat was going to completely founder if it didn't work. And so when the sails no longer did what they needed to do, or the crew, more likely the crew actually, the engine would start, but it would only start when it's like, oh, I think this is time to start, we're going to have a problem. and so, but in sympathy, I think it actually worked. But it was a great engine, and really, when we sold the boat 5 years later, or whenever it was, maybe longer than that, it was still going strong. The new owner did actually take the engine out and I think put it in a museum and put a diesel in it. Anyway, working on the boat was really great. But you know, the whole thing about desire is if you really have a strong desire to do something and you really have the intention that it's going to happen, it actually does. It's amazing. And I couldn't believe the support we had. I mean, some of the support was really fantastic. Most of the support was fantastic. People would come along and I'd be up the mast and I'd be digging out the, I'd be filling in all of the cracks in the mast. And somebody would stand down below and they'd say, what are you doing? I said, I'm filling all the cracks in the mast. And he'd say, I can see that. Why are you doing that? And I said, well, I don't want the water to get in there and for it to rot out. He said, you fill it in. He said, it will rot out, because the moisture's already in there. He said, all you're doing is locking it in. He said, take that stuff out. So I start taking it all out. Next guy comes down the dock, what are you doing? Oh, I'm taking all this stuff out of the cracks in the mast. Well, what are you doing that for? Because the moisture inside, it actually caused the mast up. Rubbish! You need to fill those bloody cracks out. And it was like that with everything. Didn't matter what you tried to do, it was the wrong thing. And I know many of you are experiencing that now.
Filling in the cracks.
Yeah. Filling in the cracks and then having to dig them all out again. See, life's a metaphor. It's incredible. Yeah. And spontaneity is the very dynamic that catapults us from one stage in our lives to the next. I can't believe the wisdom I wrote on these things, because I wrote this so long ago, you wouldn't believe it. And I'm still stuck. Eventually the work was done and the boat got really fantastic and we were really pleased. Anyway, we did set sail to go around Vancouver Island and that coming summer. Here's the interior of this rainbow. This is the original hull came up to here, and then some old timers on the island had built her up here and then decked it in. And truthfully, they'd done a brilliant job, and they'd even kept the shear of which is the curve of the cabin top, as in accord with the top of the hull, and just did a great job. And they did a really, really good job of putting it together. What I didn't know at the time, and I'm so pleased I never found out until way later, after we'd finished making our passage, was that the join between here and here was actually just I think it was a 2x2, 3x3s, 3" by 3" timber sitting on top of the old gunner and just nailed in. But it never came off, which was fortunate, because they would have reduced us back to rowing boat state. And the decks were pretty dreadful. They didn't like the sieve, so we had to do a lot of work on those. And in fact, we had to do everything. There wasn't anything that we didn't really do. We never touched the mainmast other than to fill it and unfill it, in accord with whoever wisdom was walking down the dock at the time. And the interior, we did put that all back together, and it was really cosy and comfortable. We decided not to have a bed. we decided that we would have a table that dropped down and made into a bed, so we didn't take the room up with something that wasn't in use very often. And it was only because we had too much work to do. No time to go to bed. And yeah, she was really comfy. And there was just two of us just living on it, so it really wasn't a problem. And winter in Canada was very interesting. We discovered, you know, like the cockpit filled up completely with snow, so you'd open the door and then shut it very quickly, unless you were getting a bottle of wine out of the snow. And because you open the door and say, I think I'll have one of those, take it out of the snow and put the door back in. We'd climb out of the hatch to get out. And going sailing in Canada was quite an adventure, because you had to get the ice off the sails before you pulled them up. And so, or when you pulled them up, they'd shower you with lumps of ice and snow and crap, and that's awful. I remember one day we woke up and went outside. Evelyn went outside and she came back in. She said, "You've got to do something, you've got to do something." I said, "What? Why? What's the problem?" She said, "The boat's frozen in." I said, "The boat's frozen in? You mean like iced in?" She said, "Yes, come out and have a look." And I went out, sure enough, the sea had actually frozen around the boat. Well, it was only about half-inch thick, you know. It wasn't exactly a crisis. but it was very, very impressive anyway. It was quite exciting. But going sailing was quite hard. Everybody has to have a cat, so we found ourselves a little black Burmese kitten, and she was a lot of fun. And became a great crew member. Rainbow she was an amazing old lady. She had a complete mind of her own. I discovered that my desire for her to go in certain directions was not in accord with hers. Fact.
Most of the time.
Why am I looking at you?
That's what I thought too.
It was intuition. No, but anyway, we used to try and teach each other our ways, and she always won. And one day we were sailing from, it was when this picture was taken actually, we were sailing between two islands. And we were both sitting in the cockpit. It was a beautiful sunny day, it was absolutely gorgeous. We were reading a book. I was reading a book, everyone was reading a book. We were just sitting there and I had my hand on the helm. It was just great. And the sails were set, and I let go of the helm, the boat just sailed on, just beautiful, it was so perfect. And then, all of a sudden, she turns 90 degrees. I look at her and I said, "Did you touch it?" She said, "I didn't touch it." I didn't touch it either. Why are we going in a different direction? I mean, like 90 degrees, you know, it's like, this is a deliberate move. And sails are all flapping and everything's gone to crazy. I said, "Wait a minute, don't touch it, let's see what's going to happen." And so we sailed on for about, 30, 40 yards, and then all of a sudden, back on course. What the hell's going on? I think I've got a big piece of seaweed on the rudder. Maybe that's the problem, you know. That'll turn you around because it pulls the rudder around. Look over the back, crystal clear water, nothing. And then, about 6 feet away from, no, it was maybe a bit further. Anyways, where we would have been, rose up out of the water, this log that was standing on end that was at least 6 feet across. It was a vast log, and it was just going up and down in the tide like this. And we went right over the top of it. And I said, "We're not alone." We're really not alone. And the number of incidents that we had with the boat.
The boat knew.
Well, the boat, somebody knew somewhere. And we discovered that somebody had died on her a long time ago, an old sea captain, so maybe he was still there. Suddenly, in those days we didn't know about spirits or any of that sort of stuff. I put this in because, you know, it's a happy life to be debt-free, and by the time we bought Rainbow and moved on board, I was actually told to fire the chef. I don't know what they had in their minds, they just want to keep firing people. But they told me to fire the chef, who had done a brilliant job in our kitchens and really was doing a first-class catering effort. And I said, "No." They said, "Oh, not again." I said, "No, sorry, you're being completely wrong. The guy's got 2 kids, he's got a wife, he's working all hours day and night." I said, "He's done a fantastic job, you can't complain anything about his work. Why on earth would you want to fire him?" And they said, "We can't afford 2 salaries." I said, "That's easy." I said, "I'll go." And they said, "Well, you can't go, you'll never get another job." And I said, "I don't care, I don't need a job, because my outgoings are $20 a week for berthage in the marina, and $20 a week in the grocery shop. It was 1970. And they said, well, what about your car and everything else? I said, I sold the car, paid the loan off, got an old banger. They said, well, this is ridiculous, you can't do this. And the general manager of the hotel he was up to his eyeballs in debt with a very expensive German wife who had a lot of demands on him, and he couldn't believe I would do it. Anyway, as I said, look, I'm very happy to go, so, you know, how long do you need me for? I said, I'd like to leave next week. What do you think, could you leave next month? I said, no, too long. So I was out of there, and I got a little job driving the postal vans backwards and forwards over the islands, delivering mail. And I'd have to always go on the ferry, so as soon as I got on the ferry with the van, I'd be raced upstairs to the bridge and try and get some understanding of navigating in coastal waters from the captain on the ferry boat. And it was great. It was really, really helpful. I discovered it was really helpful. So this is Vancouver Island. It hangs off Vancouver. I don't know if anybody here has been up there and sailed it. But we were living right down here in a little town called Sydney. And so we took off and we basically sailed up here, or motored most of the way because it rained and there was no wind for the longest time, 3 weeks I think. Finally we got up to the far end of the island, and it was horrific, just dreadful weather. And I thought I really had enough of this, and if we get up on this side of the coast, we'd be able to sail down, and we'll just go offshore and make sure we don't have any problems with the coast. And we got right up the very top, up there, and there's a place up there called the Nawiti Bar, and I really thought it was an Indian pub on the shore, but it actually turns out to be a big sand bar and it's not that shallow, but the seas come from around the top and up, and they meet in the middle. And the tide up there runs at something like 7 or 8 knots. And Rainbow, on a really good day with their engine going, would run about probably sort of 6 knots. So we used to go backwards quite a lot. If you were going to the wrong place. And anyway, we tried to cross the bar, and it was a real disaster. I wound up over the back of the boat in the water, trying to untangle lines that had fallen off from the rigging, and that had got wrapped around the propeller, and then the engine wouldn't start, and then couldn't get the sails down because the ropes were in the water. We couldn't afford to cut the rope because we couldn't afford to buy any more. And a whole lot of dramas, and I wound up nearly drowned. Actually, I got to a point in the water where I was so cold that I actually didn't care anymore. And like, it was just like, this is amazing. There was no fear. It was just like, oh, this is really peaceful. It was then that they pulled me out. Unfortunately, I had somebody else with us on the boat that day, and they managed to drag me out. So, overcoming fear and inertia, well, just walk into it. Well, that's very easy said. Oh dear. Yeah. And life is a sleigh ride, just let go and enjoy. When we came down the west coast, once we got around the top, which was awful, we started down, the sun came out and it was absolutely blue skies and beautiful waves, and we were going downwind, and it was sensational. We just sort of surged for 3 days, what had taken us 3 weeks to motor. And we just sailed day and night, and we were out there under the stars at night times. It was quite chilly, but it was just magnificent. And we just thought, boy, Rainbow is the most perfect boat. She'd do anything, you know. And we were so pleased, and we got down there to Victoria Harbour, and their city in Victoria Harbour is Michael and his wife and 2 kids on their boat. And they said, where have you been? We said, oh, we just went around Vancouver Island. And they said, what? That's a horrendous voyage. We said, well, you were going to do it. We were going to do it with you. And he said, well, that was just drink talking. So anyway, we spent the winter sort of tied up on a dock next to a couple of very alcoholic people who we became friends with, and drinking a dreadful thing they have in Canada called apple snap. No, I can't remember what it was called. You don't want to know. Anyways, it was dreadful stuff. It was incredibly potent, like 3 glasses and you'd be absolutely, on the floorboards. And the conversation invariably went, well, what are we going to do next year? When summer comes. And, they kept talking about going to South Pacific. Well, you should have seen their boat. We thought ours was bad, but theirs, it was a concrete boat. It had a big slab of plywood at the back for a door. And, Applejack, that's what it was called. That was the only way they managed, I think, to live on their own. Anyway, we kept pulling the charts of the South Pacific out and saying, how wonderful it was, and we kept looking at it. And eventually, come around about, April, we looked at each other and said, well, what do you think? We said, oh hell, yeah, let's just do it. Let's go. We can go as far as San Francisco, and if we don't like it, we can come back. Well, we didn't know that actually was completely impossible. But because once you get out on the west coast of North America, you do not go back up. Right? You can go down, you don't go up. And if you want to go up, you have to go out to Hawaii and go back. So this coastline here, over here, is just devastating. It's a lovely coast, it's just fabulous, as long as you want to go that way. And fortunately, that was the way we had decided that we were going to go. And so we started provisioning the boat and getting her ready. And the anchorages, we take off at weekends and we just mess about in the boat and just get to know her more and more, and started to provision her, started fixing her up, started trying to figure out what equipment we needed, like a log to tow behind the boat to make sure we knew how far we'd travelled. We bought ourselves a sextant, an old brass sextant, but then we realised that we couldn't actually read all of the sort of markings on it. So I went and bought a very cheap plastic one as a support sextant. Actually, it was a very good sextant. And we learned how to tie knots and things like that, which were very useful, I think, too. A bowline and a reef knot. We managed, I think, all the way on the bowline and a reef knot. There was so much to do, and so much to learn, and so much preparation. I mean, you think preparing for the, for the earth changes is big. You won't just prepare for an ocean voyage on a whole boat, is it? That's a trick all in itself. So the journey we planned was really just to move down to San Francisco, which is just that little leg. And then we thought we'd review our situation. Well, what actually happened was that we just kept going eventually, and found our way all across the exotic islands, the Marquesas in French Polynesia, and across to Tonga, and then Fiji, and then down to New Zealand. It doesn't look much on the chart. Another lot of water. This bit here was the big challenge, because it was 3,000 miles of water and nothing in between. And like our average speed would have probably been about 4 miles an hour. And so quite a long trip really. But the only thing is, of course, you are at least going day and night, you're not stopping. There was nowhere to stop. People say, well, did you anchor overnight? Well, no. The water's like a mile and a half down. A bit hard. Very interesting. And I love this one. You'll never be fully prepared, so you might as well learn along the way. That became our motto. Not much, there's no other option, there really wasn't. Because you can never be prepared for what life's going to throw at you. And we sailed out one morning in June, and we left the tranquility of the Juan de Fuca Straits, which are the bit of water that separates Vancouver Island from Washington. And we sailed out, and it was really peaceful, it was really great. We sailed along, it was really nice breeze, just great. So we went in and we had a really good adventure. We saw an old, well, not that old, we saw a ship that was obviously on the rocks, big ship, big freighter. And we thought, I mean, you get kind of piratical, like a pirate, when you're a yachty. And so, anything that can be plundered should be plundered. Obviously, it's there for you. And so, a big freighter sitting on the rocks, it's like prime pickings. Goodness knows what we find on that. So we rowed over to it and got alongside it and clambered up the sides. We had a young American boy with us who was going down to San Francisco, and he was hitchhiking, so he was great. And Dave was his name. And so he goes off one direction and I go off in another direction, and we're all wandering around this boat. And anyways, it's really spooky because you can feel the boat moving, or the ship moving on, on the rocks. It's not going to go down. It's been there for weeks. But anyway, he comes up. He says the hole's full of cars. And I said, oh, great. He said, they're all underwater. Oh, not so great. Is there anything we could salvage? He said, I don't know. He said, pretty hard. So anyway, we left that and went up onto the bridge. And on the bridge, on the floor of the bridge, from one end to the other end, was strewn all the charts. Like charts, all over the place. And we looked on there's a big chart table there, and we looked in that, and there was some big chart folios. And so we thought, wow, these would be really useful. So anyways, we're in such a hurry, we just grabbed them and rolled them up in big bundles. And now a chart in Canada in those days was about $4.95. I think about $25 or $27 now. But anyways, we got all these charts, and we were so thrilled. And then Evelyn comes on and she said, we're not alone on this boat, there's somebody else here. And I said, you're kidding. She said, no. She said, I just went to a cabin and there's food on the table, and there's a bottle of wine there, and it's half eaten, half drunk. And she said, there's somebody, we need to get off. Because obviously there was somebody there from the salvage collectors. And so we got off the boat into our little dinghy and rowed away frantically, clutching our great big rolls of chart, thinking, hey, we're really doing well. Now we can go safely wherever we want to go. So we get on board the boat and we move the boat and hide it away behind an island somewhere where we can't be found. And unroll our charts. And it's the South China Seas. Not so useful. Unless you wanted to go to the South China Sea, which is anyway, so we stuffed them underneath the bedding and anyway carried on our way. Next day we left and we headed out to sea in company with another yacht that was going to Hawaii. Derek and Wendy, and they were on a beautiful little boat called Tiki or something like that. Anyways, we waved goodbye to them and disappeared into the fog. They disappeared into the fog. The fog was unbelievable. You couldn't even see the front of the boat. But we had the compass, and that was fine, and we knew we had to go south, approximately. And so we just kept going, and eventually the breeze gets up and put the sails up. And got all our sails up. It's wonderful. It's really exciting. Sailing along, it's really good. A bit cold, but it's okay. And sky clears, blue sky. Fantastic. Really nice swells behind the boat. Just wonderful, pushing us along. We were doing 5.5 knots. We were really pleased with ourselves. And heading out away from the island. And all of a sudden we realised we need to take a sail down. It's getting windy. So we put a reef in the main, and about half an hour later we put another reef in the main. About half an hour later we take down the mizzen. Half an hour later we take the rest of the mainsail down. Half an hour later we take the jib down. Now we've just got 2 masts, no sails. And we're still doing 5.5 knots. And I'm thinking, why don't bother buying those sails? We don't need new sails, we're not going to use them, Anyways, we're busy sailing along, and it's really getting hairy. This picture here is about what it looked like on the deck. And it's really, the seas are picking up and getting bigger and bigger. Really big. And then, so we go into the night time. It doesn't stop. Still windy as hell. We're still moving really fast. Evelyn's now completely seasick and now completely locked in her bunk. Dave and I are taking 2 hour watches on and off in this freezing cold. It's unbelievably cold. And so we started sailing down the coast. And it took us 7 days to get to San Francisco. It was probably the most frightening thing I've ever done in my life. It was abject terror most of the time. And like the tiredness, and there's nothing you could do, you just had to keep going. And we're holding the tiller. Sometimes it would take 2 of us to hold the tiller, but he was a big guy, to hold the tiller on the boat, to keep us going the right direction. And we were terrified of rounding up in these seas, because if the boat pulled round, then of course the next wave would just roll you straight over, and without a keel we wouldn't have come up. And some of the waves came on board at the back and would just roll over the top of us and then crash right away there, Things with safety gear that we'd bought would disappear. Would just be ripped off the boat, even though it was tied on. It was unbelievable. It was a terrifying experience. And went on for days. And then somewhere in the middle, we had a day of complete calm. And it was just beautiful. Evelyn was able to get up, come up. We gave her the mainsail to sew up because it had actually got torn in the storm. We had a life raft which we'd lashed to the side. We'd inflated it and lashed it onto the shrouds at the side. And that lasted about an hour, and it just got washed straight off the boat. And so we had nothing. We had the dinghy lashed on the deck, but you couldn't have got in the dinghy. It never really occurred to us that we were going to drown, but it just seemed like we would lose the boat. I don't know where we thought we were going to go. Like, the boat's not going to make it, the boat's not going to make it. It wasn't like we weren't going to make it. And, it was, just get shitless. Well, that sums it up, actually. It was just awful. And of course, the inside of the boat was just a wash. Even though we fixed a lot of the leaks, it just, the working on the hull was just too much for it. It just leaked and leaked and leaked. And the waves coming across the deck continuously, just the water ran through the cabin roof and through every crack and slot you could find. It was just like being in a shower in icy cold water for 7 days. It was just dreadful. Eventually, San Francisco appeared. We made the fastest passage of any boat that year on the Oregon coast, and we only had the sails up one day. Amazing. So that's really where I learned to pray and really to express my gratitude. We were so shaken, we arrived in there. Evelyn was less tired than Dave and I. Dave arrived in San Francisco. I said, where do you want to go? And he said, over there, next to that dock. So we went over to this dock area, and so we pulled the boat alongside, and he said, right, see you guys, thanks very much. Grabbed his bag and ran. Very, very shakily. And I said, I'm knackered. I said, let's just go to bed. And she said, I don't think we should leave the boat here. And I said, I just can't move it. And she said, no, I really think we should move it. But she was dead right, because next morning, the tide in San Francisco is quite high and low. It's got a big rise and fall. The next morning, we would have been about 20 feet out of the water. Had we left ourselves tied up. Unfortunately, we didn't. We woke to Saturday morning, all the yachts going out, sailing, going past us. And it wasn't until I got in the dinghy later and I rowed a little bit away from the boat. But what had started out as a pristine white boat with nice blue trim and everything, over 7 days had become rust-streaked. We looked like something had come back from a battle, the Battle of Trafalgar. It looked a complete wreck. But anyway, we put the Canadian flag up. That made everybody laugh. And so we settled into life in San Francisco. But for every disaster you think, for everything that you think is going to be right, there's always something waiting for you. We sailed out of San Francisco after about 3 months, and we sailed down to San Diego, and we rounded into San Diego, and there's this beautiful, beautiful entranceway in San Diego, a channel, which is not very wide. It's probably about maybe 100 feet, 200 feet wide. It's not very wide. And it's got markers all through it, and there's thick fog. San Diego, sorry. It's always got thick fog. And we can't see a bloody thing. But anyway, I'm standing on the bow, and I can't see Evelyn who's in the back, and I'm shouting to her as we come to one buoy, and then I can hear another one in the distance, so we go to that one and then to that one. And then all of a sudden I'm saying, you know, it's much darker now than it was before. I think the fog is thickening. And there's these, well, so what did you do last night, mate? Oh, well, we had met up a couple of shirts, a couple of birds, and we had a good time. Oh, really? Yeah, well, this is bloody boring, isn't it? I'm really sick to keep a watch out here, can't see a sudden thing. And I realised we're actually underneath here, and there's one of those sort of gun placements just above us where they have crews manning to make sure that they don't bump into anybody. And so we sail happily underneath this massive aircraft carrier. I'm not sure what it was, like it was Robert Kennedy, it was one of them, big one. And behind it, there's submarines, and there's destroyers, and there's cruisers, and there's marine ships, and helicopter ships, and this entire fleet is leaving San Diego Harbor to go out to sea. Nobody saw us. And we had, you know, things in the rigging to sort of say, hey, we're here, they can see us on their radar. Nothing. This is at the height of the Vietnam War too, you know, so, and they were really paranoid about people attacking their military. Just before we left San Diego, we had a wonderful experience. I'd taken the rudder off to clean it, and I couldn't get it back. On the bottom, pintle wouldn't go in. And we met a friend, American guy, who was working in the submarine base on the other side of the harbour. And he said, look, he said, the rainbow's just come into harbour. And I said, what do you mean the rainbow's just come into harbour? He said, the submarine, the Canadian submarine called the Rainbow. And it was named after our rainbow. And I said, you've got to be kidding. He said, no. He said, I was talking to one of the guys. He said, they'd really like to see it. So he said, do you want to come round? So I said, oh, great. He said, so we went around and talked to them, and they were a bit offhand at first, but when they really discovered the story and what we were doing, they warmed to us and had us down inside the submarine, and that was really neat. It's a 1946 submarine, 1942 submarine it was. And I remember asking one of the guys down there, you know, hey, so you've just come from Tahiti, you know, do you stay submerged all the way? And he said, submerged? No. I said, well, isn't it easy travelling underwater? He said, would be if it didn't leak that much. He said, you can't leave, can't stay underwater more than 8 hours. He said, we're swimming. So I said, oh. He said, it doesn't matter. He said, they made us take the gun off because we looked too threatening. So meanwhile, there's all the American warships adjacent to them and everything, and the nuclear subs are all in there as well. And there's this little black tin thing that they built from the Americans after the Second World War. But I told them about the rudder, and they said, well, bring your boat over and we'll send the divers down. There's no problem, we can do that for you. So next morning, I happened to sail Rainbow into the nuclear submarine tanks in San Diego Harbor, completely oblivious. Quietly parked myself next to the submarine, Canadian submarine. They lower tyres so that we don't lose our paint job. And klaxons go off, and sirens go off, and the ship on the other side of the dock suddenly becomes absolutely coated in sailors, all in emergency gear, and like they've gone into action stations. And there's Marines coming down the dock, you know, in marching order with all their gear on. It's like, what's going on? Some sort of emergency here. And they surround the Canadian submarine and us, because we're on the outside of it. And finally, the captain of the Canadian submarine manages to sort of say, look, we just want to help these guys out with their rudder. And the Americans were not amused. Anyway, they allowed us to stay there for, I think, 3 hours or something while they fixed our rudder, and then we had to leave. But it was a very interesting period. Anyway, we left there and sailed off down to Mexico, and that was just beautiful. Then we decided we need to clean the bottom of the boat. So Captain Cook put his boat on the beach. Why can't we put our boat on the beach? You know, seems a logical thing. Except we overlook the fact that the tide comes in sometimes a bit rougher, and it bounces up and down until it floats off. And when it bounced up and down after I painted one side, unfortunately the water came in inside at the same level that it came up outside. And so we had to put it back on the beach very quickly and fill up the holes with epoxy and stuff, and try and get it to float. Eventually we managed to get her off the beach again, but we decided we'd never clean the bottom of the boat that way. And so we set sail from Mexico to the Marquesas. 32 days in a boat. Now imagine being in a 30-foot boat, well actually 27 feet if you just include down below, for 32 days. My brother-in-law had joined us then too, so we had my brother-in-law, Evelyn, and the cat, Gypsy. And she kept us amused, catching flying fish, which was about the only amusement we had. I have to tell you, ocean cruising, has anybody ever been ocean cruising? It is the single most boring thing in the world. Day after day, nothing but water. And the worst thing is you hit a patch at a certain distance where they have the doldrums, where you sort of cross over in the winds, or there is no wind, where the winds die out, and then new wind start, but there's a patch that you have to go through, and I think it took us nearly 10 days to get through it.
Oh.
And the boat just sits. Everything's like the logs straight down in the water. You can see forever in the water. It's really spooky because you're kind of suspended. It's really bizarre. And we found it enchanting initially, and then what happens also in the doldrums is it rains. And of course we've been in Mexico for quite a long time, so all the timber on the boat had kind of shrunk. And then it rains, and then of course it's like surfing in a sieve. Well, underneath the sieve actually, you know, it's like being in a shower. And so we had water through the boat the whole time. It was really miserable. And then the sun comes out, and then a minor little whisper of breeze is felt on the water. You can see it for the first time. The water's not glass anymore, there's little ripples. And gradually the little ripple becomes a bigger ripple and a bigger ripple, and all of a sudden you think, wait, we've got sails. Where did we put them? You know, and you hoist the sail, and all of a sudden the boat takes off. And the lift is just amazing. It's the most exciting thing in the world, to be dead stationary for so long and suddenly you're picked up and carried away. I can only think it's like that when you really let go of your fears, and having dealt with them and moved into a relationship with God. The dolphins were the nicest creatures that you could have in the ocean. They come around the boat all the time, and they spend a lot of time with us. I used to be able to hang over the front of the boat and look at the dolphins, and they'd come up, and one of them would sort of get his fin and tuck it in front of the bow and lie on his side and look up at me. There's this big eye looking at me, and I'm hanging over, and I can just about touch him, and I can't quite get him. And he'd travel like that for a long time. It's just awesome. It's really nice. So the universe has a habit of removing all the barriers when it wants you to go in a certain direction. Unfortunately, we don't always want to go in the direction that the universe wants to take us. So that's where the challenge comes. And complacency is not desirable. It invites the universe to provide a wake-up call. And that's not necessarily gentle. And I've noticed in my life that when I get very complacent, usually something very dramatic occurs. You could lose water from your tanks. And I've learned that you really do need to engage it with the wonder and innocence of a child. And innocence, really, I've also found that when I've done something, particularly with the boat and sailing, when I did something completely out of ignorance and not through my own free will of pushing it, we were totally protected. And it's been a remarkable experience doing that. The mornings at sea and the night times were just absolutely unreal. But a month at sea, we drank 17 gallons of water, 3 of us. That's all that's all we drank. How many litres is that? 17 times 4. 60 litres of water in 32 days of fresh water. The rest was, seawater. We didn't drink that. But that's all we needed to sustain ourselves. And we only had two tanks of 40 gallons, so we actually arrived with plenty of water left. Now the most exciting thing is when you've done an ocean passage and you have no idea where you are, and you've been sort of working away on a chart with little crosses based on your distance travelled each day according to your log, and basically taking latitude sights on a very plastic sextant and marking them out carefully, and you think this is it, this is the line I'm on. And you think, well, according to this, at 4:30 tomorrow morning, we should sight this island. The next island is actually Antarctica, which is a further 3,000. So we should sight this island at about dawn anyway. And it was my watch, and I was there, and the sun just starts to be, the glimmer comes up, and then you see all these clouds on the horizon. They actually look like islands, but they're not. They just lift off gradually one by one as the sun rises, and one stayed put. And it was right there, right off the starboard bow, at exactly the right moment. We travelled for 32 days with no idea where we were going really, and no navigational aids other than the plastic sextant and a compass that had a deviation on it that was horrendous, and a log which was 10% inaccurate.
And you hit the island.
And we hit the island, well we didn't hit it, we actually went around it. And
You couldn't miss it altogether.
yes, and all we would have needed to have done would have been 5 miles further away and we would have seen it. Yeah. I mean, the irony was that the next landfall that we made, actually, we did miss. we were complacent. We said, oh, we've done it, we can do Ocean's Lane, it's a piece of cake. And we totally got lost. But fortunately, it wasn't too bad. Anyway, this is a bit of an anomaly because, although the picture's lovely, I got this out of one of the tourist brochures. that wasn't actually the greeting that we received. The headdress was there, and the posture was the same, but the person was different. And a group of elderly ladies came down to greet us, and we had a lot. They were awesome. They were really wonderful, but they didn't look like that. But that's okay. We were pleased to see anybody by then. We certainly had enough of each other. The Marquesas Islands of French Polynesia are probably some of the prettiest places in the world. They're just beautiful. Unfortunately, the French had been doing nuclear testing there for quite some years, and they totally polluted all the waters around. So all the shellfish all the fish, in fact, was contaminated. And so the natives there took us out night diving for lobsters, and I couldn't find the bloody lobsters, but they saw them and they just picked them up and brought them up. And I think the first night we went out with them, we got 30 lobsters. We said, we'll just take 5. And they said, no, you can have them all, we can't eat them. And we said, what do you mean you can't eat them? They said, well, they're contaminated. But won't bother you, as a diet, we can't eat them. Well, we did eat a few, but it just sort of lost some of its appeal.
Especially when you load at night.
Yeah. I think it's very interesting. Etienne, there was a school teacher, was the guy who came over to the boat and he said, do you want to go and get some lobsters? We said, yeah, sure. Oh, really? Oh, it'd be awesome. He said, well, I said, where are you going from? Off the reefs? He said, yeah. I said, so we're just walking along the reefs? He said, well, it's night time. I said, well, we have flashlights. He said, yeah, we use flashlights. I said, so where do we go? He said, oh, out there. I said, what do you mean out there? He said, well, we go diving out there. Diving at night? Yeah. I said, with a flashlight? I said, doesn't that attract those other creatures? The pointy bits? And he said, yeah. But he said, if you're quick, you're okay. So I saw 2 sharks. I got out of the water and I left him to go and get them. So he knew what he was doing. After the Marquesas comes the Tuamotus, which is a group of very flat islands. And we had amazing welcomes in those islands. It was just beautiful. We were the first boat for something like 2 years in most of the islands. They haven't seen another yacht. Now today, I don't know what it is today, but like 10 years ago even, they were getting sort of up to 700 boats a year came through. The year we went down to New Zealand, there was only 10 boats. So it's shifted that much. It's a bit like campervans, you know. 10 years ago you wouldn't have seen more than a couple of campervans, and today there's hundreds of them. So very simple. Bora Bora was magnificent out of Tahiti, and we had some wonderful adventures with the French Navy, who befriended us. The impeller on Bang Bang blew up and flew pieces all over the cabin, and I had to get it fixed. So I went ashore, and there was this big grey warship in the harbour, and I thought, well, and I could see there were landing craft were bringing sailors ashore for R&R. And I went up to somebody who had a pom-pom on his hat and said, you know, I need to, I won't tell you my French, but anyways, I asked if they could fix my motor. So they said, well, come out to the warship and we'll ask for permission to get it done. So they took me out to the warship, and I climbed up this great big warship, and it was a landing craft carrier. So it was like an aircraft carrier, but it took landing craft inside it. And so the guy I spoke to was a petty officer from one of the machine shops. So he asked to be relieved of his shore duties so he could fix my machine and my propeller. And we became the best of friends over a bottle of pastis, and actually many bottles of pastis over a period of time, and had a great relationship with them. And that was the ship that took the first nuclear bomb to the Tuaroa. Mura. Yeah, Mura. And we were on board when they loaded it actually in Tahiti, unbeknownst to the captain who did see us eventually and went berserk. They had to put this huge ship back onto the dock to get us off because of what they were doing. We didn't realise, of course, at the time that we were having this problem. And then about 2 nights later, we were in a nightclub dancing with a bunch of these French petty officers. And one of them wanted to go for a swim, so we said, well, come back to the boat and go swimming off the boat with us. And so he said, all right, we'll do that. And so he came back, and so he dove off the boat. And as he dove off the boat, he broke his toe. And he dove in and didn't come up. And the pain was so excruciating, he passed out. And what came up was his bottom. And so my brother-in-law dived in to see if we could get him upright. It's now 2 o'clock in the morning, right? And here we've got this half-drowned naval officer from the French Navy that's sort of trying to die on our boat. And we don't quite know what to do. It was he came out of consciousness in time to give us his car keys and tell us to go and fetch somebody. So I drove the car back to the nightclub, and fortunately there was still some people there from the ship that were still dancing, playing around. And I got a nurse and another officer and took him back to the yacht. Anyways, they managed to get the guy off the boat and get him back to the warship or to the hospital and whatnot. But you could just see what we would have managed to get in headlines for that, Canadian yacht sort of captures naval officer in attempt to prevent nuclear bombs being exploded. We had a lovely time on the islands. It was just beautiful, and we spent probably about 3 months in all. My wife was given, I was given the opportunity of a work permit, which is almost unheard of. But the governor's aide really took a shine to my wife, and the deal was, well, if he can have her, then I can have the work permit. But we decided it wasn't the best deal, so I didn't really want to work that hard. So anyway, we gave that one away and sailed away. We arrived in Tonga, in this beautiful island called Nui Tokotaka. Again, we were the first boat for 18 months, and the people they were amazing. They came out to the boat, they took our passports away and said they'd go and get them stamped and everything, and we didn't see the passports for 10 days, and we kept asking for the passports back, and they said, oh, we've got a feast tonight, so can you come ashore for the feast? And we said, yeah, okay. Can we get the passports? Yeah, I'll try and remember to bring them tonight. Next day, passports? No, forgot them. Look, there's another feast tonight. And they didn't want us to leave. It was incredible. We had the best time. They were so beautiful. It was incredible. Just amazing people eking out on these very, very primitive islands. Just beautiful. I mean, they really are paradise. My heart remains really in the South Pacific. It really does. So the last leg was from Fiji, and we had an ironic experience in Fiji. We picked up a hitchhiker from one of the outer islands and took him into Suva. And when we arrived in Suva, the immigration people were waiting for us, and the hitchhiker, turns out he hasn't got his passport with him. Well, that's good. I never thought to ask, did I? And so they won't let him ashore, and he tells them that he's living with the son of the governor, one of the ministers, and Minister of Health, I think. So anyways, the net result of this is that we're impounded. We can't leave, but one department says we can't leave, the other department says we can't stay. So we're really not quite sure what our status is. And this goes on for several days. And the irony was that I actually got a job helping the guy open the new hotel school in Suva, because he was on his own. He didn't have anybody who knew how to work in the kitchens. And so I was able to, here I am, all the ministers who are arguing over whether or not we should stay or shouldn't stay are outside living in canopies, and I'm preparing him I'm getting paid for it illegally. It was very funny. Anyways, eventually time is up, and you have to avoid all of the hurricane season or cyclone season, and you've got to get to New Zealand within a certain time. And the date comes to the end, last day, so we set sail for Fiji, from Fiji to New Zealand. And well, it was essentially an uneventful voyage, except for what happened to us about 3 days out. And the first thing I know is I'm sitting out in the cockpit and I'm looking where I'm going, which is ahead. And I'm actually looking at lightning that's flashing up ahead. And really quite attractive. And I hadn't been watching or looking behind me. And when I did turn around, there's this great big green light and a red light of this very fast moving freighter that's heading straight for the back of us. I couldn't believe it. Anyways, I screamed at Ellen down below to get out with the life jackets because we're going to be run over, and I couldn't go any faster, and I angled off to try and get away from this freighter. It went past us maybe 100 yards away at the most, and Captain Cook was emblazoned down the side of the ship, and there was nobody on the bridge because I could see the bridge. It was all lit up. There wasn't a soul up there, and we actually were carrying running lights on that time, which was unusual for us because normally we didn't bother. But that scared me to death. It was just, I was sitting in the cockpit shaking, and everyone says, you know, would you like me to sit with you for a little bit? And I said, yes please, because I'm really feeling very nervous now. And she said, can I do anything? And I said, do you mind pumping the bilge? Because I said, well, I think we should keep the water down. Anyway, so she's pumping the bilge, and it's a steel-handled whale gusher pump with a black plastic handle. And at this moment, there's this almighty crack. And all you can't hear a thing because your hearing is gone. And this giant flash and this smell of burning. And we were hit by lightning. And it took the top of the mast blew off, right the way down to where the rigging goes around the mast. Fortunately for us, it went that way, so it actually stopped there, but the whole of the top part of the mast blew away. And it was smouldering, and you could smell it. There's bits of wood all over the cabin roof. And I thought, you know, I thought we'd sunk. I mean, I thought the boat was going down. It was really, really bizarre. Anyway, it turned out we were still sailing along quite happily. Rainbow was doing her thing. And I'm not quite sure why God chose to give us that sort of welcome, but 3 days later we found ourselves in New Zealand. And we did have to fix up the top of the mast, but it wasn't that much of a problem. And New Zealand is a beautiful place. We came into the north end of the North Island, into a place called the Bay Islands, which is a real beautiful haven for sailors. It's a protected drowned river system, and it's beautiful, lovely foliage, very few houses, lots of islands, and really a magnificent place to be. So I put in here, our fears and misgivings will activate the universal power of attraction as easily and quickly as our trust and allowance. And if I look back over the whole journey and I just look at the law of attraction, you know, you could almost see where we did something wrong or something happened to us, and depending on our reaction to it attracted or created for us a solution. It was just magnificent how the universe came in to support us. We arrived with just $19 after probably 2 years of sailing, and we left with 300.
Wow.
We did do a little bit of work on the way, but not very much. So life is really bountiful in the moment that we give ourselves to it. Life only shows lack when we feel that lack within ourselves, and when we hold back in fear that we're not enough. I did feel inadequate, I must admit, and I think the sea taught me that you are inadequate. And the truth is that you can never compete with such a force. And that what you have to do really essentially is just give yourself to it and trust that it actually will take care of you. And it does. And in our receiving we discovered the desire to give back. And wherever we went we tried to help people, and we tried to really honour all of the people who helped us. And without all of their support we would never have ever got this far or got here. And so we always gave where we could and what we could do. And that always seems to carry us into a new reality. And it's almost like a stepping stone from place to place. So it really is about making the decision, I guess, to, I don't need to tell you guys, but you know, how we've all chosen to make the decision to step into something, into the unknown, and take a huge gamble and risk everything. You know, all the things that keep us comfortable. all the things that keep us warm and fuzzy and make us feel safe, and throw them all out the window and say, what the hell with it? When everybody's saying, are you mad? Do you want to belong to this group or that group? Do you want to do this? Why would you want to do that? Why would you ever take such a gamble? But the truth is, if you don't do it, you'll never find out about yourselves. Because the only way you can really find out about who you are is by taking the gamble and taking the risk and going out into the unknown. And even though I did that some years ago, it really, for me anyway, set perhaps a condition on the way I wanted to live my life. And although I found myself now probably as inadequate as I did then, my inadequacy is no longer perhaps with the sea, but with a much greater force. And my sense of relationship to that greater force, God, whom I know to be my friend and to be the one who cares for me and who loves me, is so similar to the experiences that I had there. And they just carried on through the years. So I'm nearly 70, and this took place when I was 24. So it's a huge time difference, and yet every experience in my life, even including the start of our relationship and the amount of courage that took to break away from what was probably just looking down the tracks of being a grandparent and going down that route, rather than saying, no, I'm not ready to give up the proper life yet, and I still want to feel into everything. I still want to explore all the fears, and I want to explore all of the adventures, and I want to explore all of the opportunities. And I don't want to just sit down and be quiet and sit in a big armchair, although it would be nice for a little while sometimes, just to sit in an armchair.